There was a mistake in the program, and if you are here for performing ethnicity, you're in the wrong room. So don't everybody get up and leave, please. All right, I'm Catherine Preston, and I am chairing this session on binders volumes, which is totally cool. This session will be live streamed, so if you have questions afterwards, use the microphone. David Garcia will bring it around to you. We acknowledge that Tacoma lies in the traditional homelands of the Puyallup tribe. The Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854 forcibly removed Native peoples to clear a way for colonial settlement, but the Puyallup people have cared for and lived on these lands since the beginning of time and continue to do so today. They have a new restaurant in town called Woven, run by the Puyallup tribe. It's on the water. The Society for American Music sends gratitude to the Puyallup tribe upon whose ancestral lands we convene for this conference. We recognize that this land acknowledgement is one small step toward true allyship, and we commit to uplifting the voices, experiences, and histories of the indigenous peoples of this land and beyond. And I want to insert a little comment here, and that is that in the last couple of years at this society, I have been remarkably pleased to see how information about and recognition of indigenous musical cultures in this country has become a part of this society. It's been wonderful. And I welcome it as a long-term member, and I hope everyone else does too. But it doesn't feel forced, it doesn't feel out there, it feels like it's part of us, as it should. So, yay for us. This session is being live streamed and recorded. Be aware that people asking questions may be visible during the live stream. We ask that you would please refrain from videos or photos of materials presented during this session. We would also like to remind you of SAM's Code of Ethics, which commits us to, quote, respect the diversity of opinions as expressed by its membership, end quote, and to, quote, maintain a professional level of courtesy, respect, and objectivity in all society activities. So we are here to hear papers in a wonderfully united session that explores the significance of binders volumes in 19th century American culture, South America, as well as Southern America. Each of our presenters used these pieces of material culture to illuminate women's musical agency via annotations and marginalia in the scores, and to explore more broadly the various elements of the cultures in which these pieces of material culture were produced, including the creation of networks and community. Our first presenter is Elizabeth Bush, who is a second-year master's student at the University of Maryland, College Park. Her thesis explores constructions of gender, race, and sexuality in 19th century binders volumes. She is also a project archivist for University of Maryland's Keesing collection, which is a collection of popular music and cultural materials, including items related to the Vietnam War, Elvis Presley, and the Watergate scandal. That's a rather interesting combination. Her paper is titled True Women Are Angels, Gender and Sexuality in 19th Century Binders Volumes, in case you can't read what she has up there. It's not there, but okay. Anyway, you have the title. Welcome.
Louisa May Alcott opens the second half of her iconic 1869 novel Little Women with the chapter Gossip, in which she relates what the four March sisters have been up to in the 3 years since the end of the first part's events. While Meg, Jo, and Amy are all flourishing, full of plans for the future, Alcott's summary of Beth's state of affairs is less than optimistic. Quote, not an invalid exactly, but never again the rosy, healthy creature she had been, yet always hopeful, happy, and serene, busy with the quiet duties she loved, everyone's friend, and an angel in the house long before those who loved her most had learned to know it. In addition to foreshadowing Beth's recurring illness and eventual death in the coming pages, Alcott draws on one of the chief images of 19th century womanhood to describe Beth, the most musical, domestic, and self-sacrificing of the sisters, the angel in the house. The packaging of 19th century standards for womanhood through angelic imagery stems from writer Coventry Patmore's 1854 extended poem, The Angel in the House. This angel represents the most important qualities of the cult of true womanhood, a term used both by 19th century writers and by their critics today. In her foundational work on true womanhood, historian Barbara Welter lists the 4 cardinal virtues of this cult as, quote, piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity, end quote. In this presentation, I explore contradictions to the ideals of the angel in the house and the cult of true womanhood in a selection of Binder's volumes held in the Jacqueline Bolton Stock collection on 19th century music at the University of Maryland Special Collections in the Performing Arts. Altogether, the 16 volumes belonging to 14 women contain music dating from 1826 to 1912, with the bulk of the materials dating from 1840 to 1880. I argue that while some Binder's volumes in the collection do uphold the standards of the cult of true womanhood, most reveal a much more complex relationship between women's day-to-day lives and the ideals to which they purportedly held. Furthermore, rather than merely serving as means for heterosexual marriage, these volumes suggest female communities that sustained their owners before and after their weddings, both platonically and romantically. In what follows, I provide a brief overview of literature on the angel in the house before examining the role of annotations in complicating 19th century gender ideals and the role of music selection in hinting at non-heteronormative sexuality. Critiques of the angel in the house and the cult of true womanhood abound in feminist studies. Author Virginia Woolf addressed her quest to kill the angel in the house in her 1931 speech to the Women's Service League. After describing how the angel's, quote, purity was supposed to be her chief beauty, her blushes, her great grace, end quote, a description very similar to Patmore's original, Woolf states bluntly, had I not killed her, she would have killed me. Some of the earliest works of feminist musicology, Marcia Citrin's Gender in the Musical Canon and Susan McClary's Feminine Endings, reference the angel in the house in a similarly negative vein to assess the place of women within music history. Other scholars have pointed out the racial implications behind the angel in the house and the cult of true womanhood, both of which emblemize white femininity. In her work on controlling images of Black womanhood, which, quote, make racism, sexism, and poverty appear to be natural, normal, and an inevitable part of everyday life, end quote, social theorist Patricia Hill Collins explores how, in the context of the cult of true womanhood, quote, the manly image as the other symbolizes the oppositional difference of mind-body and culture-nature thought to distinguish Black women from everyone else. In other words, the angel image only had value in uplifting white femininity so long as adherents could contrast it with degrading ideas about Black femininity. Sound studies scholar Jennifer Lynn Stover explores similar ideas in her reception history of 19th century vocalists Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, a Black woman, and Jenny Lind, a white woman. Quote, whereas Lind could be angelic to white feminists and anti-feminists alike, Greenfield could only dubiously borrow an angel's voice, end quote. Stover goes on to analyze whiteness as being implicit in angelic imagery in the 19th century. As the scholarship on the racialization of the cult of true womanhood makes clear, gender ideals promoted in works such as Patmore's were firmly nestled within a culture of white supremacy. Angelic ideals of femininity often dovetailed with ideals of the parlor. Historian Mary Kelly argues that U.S. American culture placed a great premium on notions of gentility, which one could achieve through sewing, artwork, and other properly supervised activities linked to the parlor, especially piano playing. According to musicologist Ruth Soley, what she terms parlor songs, quote, produce women who are correctly girled according to the needs of the society in which they are destined to take their place, end quote. Even when parlor songs conducted their proper girling, the process and results were much messier than any cult or ideal could indicate. Binder's volumes reveal a far from passive relationship between girls and their music, particularly through annotations that speak to the reality of practicing the piano. This duty would have made up anywhere from half an hour to 2 hours of girls' daily lives. A testament to these rigorous practice sessions, fingering markings appear throughout all 16 volumes I examined, and some also include more detailed notes. For example, Mary A. Dow wrote "Don't forget A flat" on aria alla scozzese, while Marcia Spencer wrote and circled F, C, G sharp in pencil at the top of the minute gun at C, a piece in A major. Markings that go beyond simply aiding in practice and towards demonstrating musicians' active roles in defining their repertoire also appear throughout the collection, albeit less frequently. Anna S. Pattison seems to have been a serious music student. Handwritten notes about different key signatures appear on the back of Home Sweet Home with Brilliant Variations and Tyrolean Favorite. The final flourish in the coda to her copy of Gustav Lesner's Gloriana includes a penciled-in final fifth octave of a printed four-octave A-flat major arpeggio. One member of the Avery family made even more significant additions to Henry Coleman's The Flowers Are Faded, adding a B-flat and F to the last eighth note of the first measure, turning an F major chord in first inversion into an anticipation of the next measure's C7 in second inversion. The anticipation does not resolve according to the rules of voice leading. Still, this change reveals the musician's sense of agency in her music making. Even if Dow, Pattison, and the Avery player did not make these changes of their own volition, but were encouraged by their teachers, the presence of written edits suggests the possibility of unwritten ones added for the sake of dramatic effect. Both cases see a 19th century pianist moving beyond simply accepting what the composer and publisher had created and beginning to make it their own. Amateur musicians also altered the printed text to add humor, perhaps to relieve the monotony of practicing. In this case, it seems far less likely that a teacher would be responsible for the annotations. For instance, May Seymour included Luigi Arditi's duet for piano, Il Baccio, in her bound volume. While practicing the piece, Seymour, her duet partner, or someone using her volume at a later date wrote an A in pencil over the printed O at the end of the primo marking and then penciled in Donna. The corrected phrase now reads prima donna, the attitude that musicians performing the first part stereotypically adopt. Dow turned her attention to the composer's name in The Approach of Spring, writing a hedgehog over the similar sounding name A Herzog. Dow did not add any practice markings to the rest of the piece as she did on other selections. As a result, the hedgehog edition does not seem to have been born out of frustration of practicing the piece over and over again, suggesting a more playful sense of agency over her music's appearance. In some cases, Binder's volumes also reflect the communities that were central to the owner's girlhood. Duets are common in these books. For example, Mrs. E.M. Riesli's volume includes 5 duets, which also appear in Spencer's, Seymour's, Miss Toulou's, Pattison's, Dow's, Mary Applegate's, and Clara Anderson's books. Previous scholars have noted that these duets provided ample opportunities for socially sanctioned heterosexual flirting. Girls might also practice duets with their friends, though, as Clara Anderson's collection suggests. She had Albert S. Caswell's Jolly Sisters, as arranged for piano four hands, found in her volume. On top of this piece, Anderson wrote Saunders, Kingsbury, Anderson, Clark. Splendid. Anderson's implication seems to be that she and the 3 other people, likely other girls or young women, were close enough to be considered Jolly Sisters themselves. Her annotation indicates the importance of Binder's volumes and wider piano playing culture to developing relationships of all types, not just future marriages. In addition to platonic female friendships, bound sheet music albums in the stock collection occasionally suggest the possibility of romantic relationships not sanctioned by the cult of true womanhood, especially the book belonging to a Miss Toulouse. One of Miss Toulouse's selections, the 80-page elocution piece, Evenings in Greece, First Evening, by Thomas More and Henry R. Bishop, simultaneously underlines her likely high social standing and the potential for that high social standing to offer musical expressions beyond heteronormative standards. One scene in Evenings in Greece imagines a gathering of nymphs, also referred to as maidens, after all the men in their village have gone to war. One of the nymphs has recently visited Leucadia and the cliff where Sappho jumped to put out, quote, the fatal fire at once of both her heart and lyre, end quote. The nymph readies her lute and sings for her companions, quote, in a voice whose thrilling tone fancy might deem the lesbian's own, end quote. A short piece for voice and pianoforte, Sappho at her loom, follows the set of poetry, an excerpt of which I will play now. This excerpt comes from a recording that I made with another graduate student at the University of Maryland, Mary Shea Keeley-Custis, in February 2025. thank you for bearing with the audio difficulties. The next poetry section sees the attendees inspired by Sappho's love to realize, quote, how much their hearts resembled hers, felt as they made their griefs their own, that they too were love's worshippers, end quote. The homoerotic undertones of a group of women listening longingly to a nymph channeling Sappho's lovesickness are difficult to overlook, raising the question of how this piece fits into a volume whose purpose would ostensibly have been to demonstrate that Miss Toulouse, in musicologist Candace Bailey's words, have been properly brought up. The love poetry never uses a pronoun to describe the narrator's lover, meaning that they could be either female or male. However, Moore included an asterisk after the nymph's performance of one of Sappho's speeches that indicates that he has read Sappho's poetry in the original Greek. Literary critic Margaret Reynolds notes that, by the 19th century, most people interested in Sappho's writing would have had access to Fragment 1, in which Sappho addresses the goddess Aphrodite as her lover, and Fragment 31, in which she describes her feelings of deep physical attraction, albeit in a manner that is not explicitly queer, as well as smaller extracts. Furthermore, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, lesbian referred to inhabitants of or other things related to Lesbos, the island where Sappho lived, as early as 1550. However, beginning in 1732, over 100 years before Miss Toulouse collected evenings in Greece, the word also took on the connotation of, quote, characterized by sexual activity between women, end quote, as it is commonly used today. Scholarship into the figure of Sappho in various 19th century contexts further supports a clear reading of Miss Toulouse's inclusion of evenings in Greece in her volume. In her work Singing Sappho, musicologist Melina Essi documents adaptations of Sappho's suicide throughout Italian opera and popular culture. According to Essi, these texts generally depicted Sappho as heterosexual, but her lesbian connotations were not entirely lost in these contexts. Essi argues that in many operas and novels, authors, quote, dealt with the rumors of Sappho's transgressive love for women by replacing one sort of sexual transgression, same-sex love, with another, uncontrollable lust for the opposite sex, end quote. None of the adaptations that Essi considers include the narrative frame of a musical gathering of women as featured in Evenings in Greece. The context is not without precedent in Sapphic histories, though. Reynolds writes that before Greek writers transcribed Sappho's poetry, it would have been sung in a group, likely of women. Even aside from the connotations of lesbian and the presence of Sappho, the fact that Evenings in Greece imagines a group of women making music together is subversive in and of itself. For example, musicologist Petra Mayer-Fraser argues that British novels written in the era that Miss Toulouse compiled her volume avoided depictions of music making in all female settings because of how deeply music and courtship were connected. No notes or dedications in Miss Toulouse's volume include her first name, nor does her title ever change to Mrs., followed by a new last name. Given her situation in a time period when 90% of women married men, she would have been well aware of the expectations on her to marry and have children. The fact that she included a piece worth $15.80 at a time when most sheet music pieces sold for between 25 and 50 cents suggests that she was a woman of financial means. Her inclusion of J.B. Coppinger's The Holiday Scottish with the pen dedication, Miss Toulouse, with the respects of the composer, hints that she also possessed a great deal of cultural capital. Miss Toulouse's conception of Sappho cannot be definitively stated. However, she likely understood that women making music together without male supervision was considered inappropriate, even titillating, and certainly could have been aware of Sappho's lesbian connotations. It is possible that her wealth and position allowed her to include such a piece without drawing reproach from those who might see her volume while calling on her and visiting in her parlor. In doing so, Miss Toulouse would not be the only woman to hide her true feelings in her music. For example, musicologist Wanda Goodman discusses the role of music in Binder's volumes as facilitating heterosexual courtship and romance without threatening either party's modesty. Drawing on scenes from novels by Austen and Goethe, musicologist Matthew Head argues that music allowed women, quote, a means of polite courtship, of acquiring a husband, while at the same time hiding attachments deemed inappropriate or transgressive, end quote, as same-gender relationships would have been considered in Miss Toulouse's day. The ways that women and girls interacted with their sheet music collections, both by having particular pieces bound into volumes and by the annotations that they made throughout these volumes, reflect the importance of extrafamilial relationships, as well as the significance of musical practice and community to upper and middle class girlhood. Furthermore, they at times suggest the possibility of relationships that push the boundaries of heteronormative ideals. Evenings in Greece is in the minority, though not alone, in terms of its explicitly queer-coded content. But even pieces that do not involve queer undertones often refuse the demure performance of sexuality and gender demanded by 19th century US American social mores. This subversive undercurrent and its place within a more expansive history of gender and sexuality in the United States have become much more urgent to articulate of late. As of February 2025, the Stonewall National Monuments website no longer mentions transgender people, either in its acronyms or in its historical context. A shocking erasure, given the significant role that trans people played in the events of Stonewall and the wider gay rights movement. It is incredibly unlikely that this action is the last act of queer erasure under the current presidential administration in the United States. Taking seriously the evidence throughout amateur music making of non-heteronormative sexualities is a way to prevent a similar form of queer erasure throughout music history, and a way to prevent the LGBTQIA+ community's historical and contemporary erasure in service of white supremacist and heteropatriarchal governmental agendas. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for some questions, and we have a microphone wielder coming around. Are there questions? Okay, I will start off with a question.
Basically, I'm curious about this Tom Moore, Henry Raleigh Bishop collaboration. Which I had no idea that Tom Moore and Henry Raleigh Bishop collaborated. So, is there anything you can comment about that? Add information about it?
So I don't know anything about their process. From what I've found online, it seems that Thomas Moore wrote much of the lyrics. Those are attributed to him. But he's also known as a composer himself. So I'm not quite sure what the interaction would have been. Other archives date this piece to 1826. The edition in Miss Toulouse volume is not dated. But I'm continuing to collect information about this piece. So if anybody knows about it, please do let me know.
Well, Moore was a poet, so he wasn't much a composer. He was using Irish melodies in his Irish melodies. But I just find it really fascinating that the two of them are working together. Other questions? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you. Can you speak to a little bit more about working with these materials and sometimes having annotations that you don't know necessarily when they were added? I think you did a really great job of kind of addressing that, but I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. That is a really big concern with working with these, especially because there's two sort of levels of curation going on. One is the women themselves and any annotations that may have been added in their lifetimes, but also the original musicologist who purchased these, I think around the 70s, although I've not been able to identify that exactly, often went through and made her own annotations. So for example, there are 2 volumes belonging to Alice Spalding, and on the inside, someone wrote volume 1 and volume 3. I'm pretty sure that has stopped sparking the musicologist who purchased them, but I can't be definitively sure. And there are a couple others with her markings where it's like attributions of where pieces were debuted and things like that. The approach that I generally take is informed by speculative history, by scholars such as Sadia Hartman and Daphne Brooks, where I'm careful to outline what the possibilities could have been, but I also try to avoid saying definitively this is what a particular person meant when they wrote this. Because as you point out, I often don't know who the person was. Thank you.
Yes.
Hey, thank you for your paper. I have some interest in that piece, Il Bacio. And I wondered how, you just mentioned that some of the pieces, or some of the binders volumes, it seems like it's hard to date them. But I know that piece was particularly popular in 1887 and 1888 because there was this whistler, Mrs. Alice J. Shaw, for whom it was often a piece of her program. And I was just wondering if that makes sense in regard to, things about that binders volume, when that would have been put in there. I mean, it could also be much later, but it looks like something from around that time.
Yes, thank you. Actually, that's very helpful. I wrote down her name so I can look up more about this whistler. That one belongs to May Seymour, who was born in the late 1860s after the Civil War had ended. She actually is one of the people who I've been able to find through Ancestry.com. She grew up in New Jersey, and she ended up attending Binghamton High School in New York, as well as New York State's Library School, and actually had a career as a librarian and passed away in the early years of the 20th century. Actually, she was preparing to go to an international library conference in Belgium and passed away sort of on the eve of her voyage. So that's very helpful to know. I could get a better idea of why she might have collected this piece. So thank you.
We have time for a very quick last question if anyone has one. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do you need to set up?
Okay, well, our next presenter is putting his computer together here. Our next, Juan Fernando Velasquez is an assistant professor at the Moore School of Music at the University of Houston. His research intersects cultural history and sound studies to explore the connection between sound, technology, and social formation processes, and address privilege, modernity, and sound ecologies in Latin American cities. His first book, Los Ecos de la Villa, which is 2011, won an award from the Secretary of Culture of Medellin, Colombia, and his second, Inscribing Sounds, Music Technologies and Oral Culture in Late 19th and Early 20th Century Colombia, is under contract with the Oxford University Press. His paper is titled, Only a Family's Memento, Binders Volumes as Micro-Archives.
Thank you, Catherine, for this nice introduction and for moderating this panel. I'm really glad for sharing this space today with Elizabeth and Melly and having this wonderful conversation about binder volumes. The archive of the Biblioteca Luis Echevarría Villegas at EAFIT University in Medellin preserves the Echevarría Binders volume, a collection of manuscripts, musical magazines, clippings, and printed scores gathered between 1816 and 1888 by sisters Ana and Cristina Echevarría. This album contains 76 musical pieces that illustrate the sisters' musical preferences and reflect trendy airs popular among the new urban bourgeoisie in Colombia's salons at the turn of the 19th century, offering a glimpse into the conventions imposed by good taste or fashion. Indeed, we have interesting clues here. A generation before, the place that had the walls and the pasillo probably will be occupied by the contradanza. Like many American or European binders volumes, the contents of the Echevarría Binders volume mainly consist of two primary categories: solo piano music and selections for voice and piano. This musical repertoire illustrates how the Salon sonically embodied the aspirations of cosmopolitanism among the local bourgeoisie. Manuscripts of fantasians based on Italian operas, music printed in Europe, and waltzes, often performed by señoritas refinadas o mujeres del mundo, two terms often used to describe accomplished women who blended ideas of feminine Catholic purity and a Victorian sensibility. In addition, the ladies played the piano, a musical instrument that symbolized good taste and distinction for the urban bourgeoisie in 19th century Latin America. Additionally, the Echevarria Binders volume served as a cherished keepsake with an intimate character. For this reason, the album contains numerous descriptions, including annotations, footnotes, and indications that reveal a network of individuals connected in various ways. An analysis of the studies on binders volumes published by Latin American researchers since the 1990s, including, among others, Maria Victoria Casas, Laura Jordan, Fernanda Vera, Manuel Izquierdo, Josefina Massa, Elian Duque, Jael Vitran, Carmen Garcia, and Juan Fernando Sanz, not only highlights their significance as evidence of a thriving cultural phenomenon essential for understanding various aspects of musical practice in the region during the 19th century, but also suggests that the inscriptions in these documents are open to multiple interpretations, as they reveal networks that often follow a rhizomatic structure. For instance, the relationships established through references to friends and family in a binder volume can highlight the role of music within the families alone. Conversely, other inscriptions and markings may illustrate the uses of binders volumes in charity events, civic commemorations, or music education. However, instead of using these approaches, I propose to extend the scope of the study of Latin American binders volumes by examining their materiality through the lens of mobility and the circulation of music to illuminate the transnational networks that shape them. This paper is organized in two sections to achieve this goal. First, it traces the familiar history of the Echevarria sisters to examine the networks surrounding the binders volume and to explore how they facilitated the circulation and mobility of music between Colombia and Venezuela during the late 19th century. Subsequently, this paper analyzes how women performing music in Colombian salons became collectors who gathered music and interacted with the documents so that their binders volumes became both mementos and microarchives. Besides the American and European editions or manuscripts commonly found in Colombian binder volume, the Echevarria binders volume features an unusual amount of music published in Venezuela, around the 25% of the works it contains, including 17 pieces published in 12 issues of El Zancudo, a literary and cultural magazine founded and directed by Heraclio Fernandez and Gabriel José Aramburu, published in Caracas between 1876 and 1889. This raises an important question. How did the Echevarria sisters gather music published in Venezuela? The Echevarria sisters may have obtained some scores through librarians or merchants who imported and sold periodicals, magazines, and music in Colombia, like Pedro Pablo Calvo in Bogotá. However, these entrepreneurs usually brought publications from Europe and the United States. Therefore, the substantial amount of printed music published in Venezuela that exists in this binders volume indicates that the sisters likely sourced some of these scores through alternative means. Further analysis of the annotations and dedications in the album confirms that Echevarria's family was a part of an intellectual and artistic network linking Colombia and Venezuela. For example, at the bottom of the cover of the waltz Los Niños Desamparados by the cousin of the owners of the album, Rosa Echevarria, we can notice that Cecilio Echevarria was the father of Ana and Cristina. Cecilio and his brother Leon were two renowned Venezuelan printers who settled in Bogotá in 1848 after being invited to work at Neo Granadino, a new press owned by the Colombian liberal politician, intellectual, and journalist Manuel Enciso, who served as Secretary of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of New Granada and co-founded in 1848 the first Philharmonic Society established in Bogotá. Leon and Cecilio were skilled printers and notable figures in Bogotá's liberal intellectual elites, which were organized around El Granadino and the Freemason Lodge. After their time in the press, the Echevarria brothers became business partners with Enciso in a new establishment called Imprenta Echevarria Hermanos. This press was more than just a commercial venture. It also functioned as a workshop where the brothers trained local printers in the use of steam-powered printing presses. The wealth of data regarding the lives and endeavors of the Echeverria men in external archives starkly contrasts with the limited reliable information about the sisters. For example, their birth dates and the circumstances surrounding their piano lessons remain largely unknown. From this standpoint, this binder's volume represents more than just a family heirloom. It functions as a microarchive that appears to be the only tangible remnant of the sisters' existence, at least to some degree. Researchers should consider this discrepancy between the amount of information available about men and women in the binder's volume and this external microarchive that surrounds the binder's volume, composed by sources like periodicals, obituaries, memoirs, or legal documents. Although this issue highlights the divide in 19th century Colombia between a heteropartical public sphere and a matriarchal private sphere, evidence within the Echeverria binder's volume suggests that Ana and Cristina Echeverria benefited from their fathers and uncles' social and cultural capital. The prominent place of the Echeverria's family men within the local and regional printing industry allowed the sisters to gather contemporary, rare, and expensive musical editions printed in Colombia and Venezuela. An example is this piece called La Melancolía, published in Caracas by the German immigrant Alfred Goethe, one of the first scores printed that use a chirographic technique and published in Venezuela. Let's hear a little bit of the piece, because also highlights this cosmopolitan undertone of Chopin's music to some extent. In other instances, the music scores were gifts. For instance, a final annotation in the manuscript of the Waltz per ton olvido shows that this piece, composed in the Caribbean city of Barranquilla on September 12th of 1884, was a gift by Enrique Lopez Osorio, a family friend and member of the Freemason Lodge. The sisters likely received this score as a manuscript, a personal gift for their album. Indeed, Lopez Osorio is not a really well-known composer in Colombia. And family members also gifted music scores to the family, to their sisters, as their cousin Rosa, who I mentioned before. This dedication highlights the album role as a family keepsake created by Ana and Cristina. It also calls attention to the involvement of men in a tradition that researchers have often perceived as entirely feminized. From this perspective, the role of this transnational network in shaping the Echeverria binder's volume suggests that migration is a critical factor to consider when examining the circulation of music among Latin American countries in the second half of the 19th century. However, an analysis focused on migration also reinforces a conceptual framework prioritizing national heritage and belonging over other themes in music studies. This issue could be problematic for two reasons. First, it emphasizes the geographic origin or location of various actors rather than the actions and practices that connect them across the network. And second, it reinforces a dominant narrative of music history as national music history. Despite the valuable contribution of this respected tradition, I argue that an alternative approach to studying binder's volumes could direct its attention toward the mobility and circulation of musical repertoires and practices rather than focusing solely on migration. This approach promises to introduce new global perspectives, revealing dynamics rooted in networks established by different actors throughout the global south, while highlighting how the urban bourgeoisie negotiated notions of the local and the global through music and musicking in the salon. For instance, by gathering and performing symbols of cosmopolitan taste, like adaptations for an opera next to national airs such as pasillos, danzas, merengues, or cuecas, two issues that deserve further attention and examination in fields like global music history. Indeed, the annotations and contents of the Echeverria Binder's volume suggest that, on the ground, the dynamics of cultural interchange sometimes work against national borders, following familiar bonds, friendship, and shared values. Such relationships fostered the mobility of people and the circulation of musical repertoires between Colombia and Venezuela in a way that can't be explained as a phenomenon exclusively relying or restricted on migration. Instead, it suggests that migration was an additional factor fostering mobility and the circulation of music and ideas, a process in which women making music were crucial actors. The history of the Echeverria Binder's volume shows that, along with friendship and family ties, shared ideological principles, like being part of a liberal elite, and common sense of belonging to specific groups, associations, and societies, such as the Freemason Lodge, also shaped the networks involved in creating Binder's volumes. Indeed, an analysis of descriptions in the Echeverria Binder's volume reveals that relationships formed through Freemason Lodge established a transnational network of peers who embraced liberal ideas, fostering the exchange of tastes and cultural practices throughout the north of South America. As mentioned earlier, the Echeverria brothers were members of the Freemason Lodge. After settling in Bogota, they joined the Estado de Tequendama No. 11 Lodge, the premier Freemason lodge in the city, whose members included Ancisa, the president, Tomás Ciprián de Mosquera, the liberal politician and general Benjamin Herrera, the liberal politician and writer José María Samper, his wife, the writer and intellectual Soledad Acosta de Samper, the English architect Thomas Reed, the Italian opera impresario Antonio Bracale, among others. Later, Leon Echeverria advanced within the lodge, serving as the seal keeper and grand master for 2 years. As a result, the brothers regularly hosted social gatherings with other lodge members and in their press and homes. Did Anna and Cristina perform music compiled in their Binder's volume during these gatherings? A dedication note in the Echeverria Binder's volume seems to support this theory. A handwritten annotation in the manuscript of the Pasillo, Medical Alma, by M. López Osorio, notes that Leon Echeverria commissioned this piece and dedicated to his close friend, Clementina Herrera, sister of the liberal leader Benjamin Herrera, and one of the 2 women settled in the lodge. Ana and Cristina likely performed this Pasillo during a gathering as a tribute to Herrera. In addition to this anecdote, the annotation highlights that by performing music within the family salon, Ana and Cristina participated in the network that linked the family and friends, making the mobility of music gathered in the volume possible. Hence, contents and annotations in the Echeverria Binder's volume suggest that musicking within the 19th century salon connected different actors. At the same time, they highlight women's significant role in music circulation, illustrating how they became agents participating in such a network as performers, consumers, collectors, muses, and creators. For instance, a series of 5 pieces by Rosa Echeverria, an issue unusual in Colombian Binder's volumes, finding music composed by women, demonstrated that musicking strengthened familiar networks among the Echeverria women, while allowing their family to express values, taste, and interests they share with their peers. In other words, the role of the Echeverria sisters and collectors as collectors and performers of music featured in the album bridged the public sphere, where their father and uncles pursued their professional, political, and intellectual lives, and the private sphere, where family members socialized with their relatives and friends. From this perspective, this Binder's volume is more than a family heirloom or a record of a musical repertoire gathered and performed during a specific period of time. Instead, I argue that simultaneously encompasses all of these aspects, evolving into a microarchive that provides material evidence of the cultural and social practices the Echeverria sisters adopted and performed as they gathered, intervened, and played the music compiled in their binders volume. For this reason, the inscriptions in the Echeverria binders volume illustrate two different but interconnected forms of agency involving the mobility of practices and the transnational circulation of musical repertoires. First, individuals possess the agency to create, consume, share, and collect documents through networks formed by familial ties, commercial transactions, ideological beliefs, or membership in a particular class or social class or organization that spans national boundaries. Second, the agency of practices to create objects, like the Echeverria's binder volume, which allows actors within the network to express and share tastes. Nevertheless, researchers should consider two interconnected issues while examining binders volume, like the Echeverria binders volume. First, the practices that articulate different epistemes surrounding the selection and usage of these documents, and second, how annotations and dedications can serve as inputs and outputs that illuminate various connections and information, linking the materiality of such documents to others beyond the microarchive of the binder's volume. By following different pathways traced at these inputs and outputs, researchers can unveil a history that reveals as much about its owners as it does about the context surrounding them and the practices that made the Echeverria's binder volumes and similar documents possible. Ultimately, as the analysis presented up to this point suggests, studying the binder's volume as a microarchive reveals new transnational networks and histories involved in music's production, circulation, and consumption in the late 19th century, connecting, in this case, Colombia and Venezuela, but could be any country or any place. These networks nourished the repertoire collected in this album. At the same time, they facilitated the spreading of new ideas, values, tastes, and forms of socialization articulated around the salon, where the Echeverria sisters played the music that they gathered. Thus, beyond the scope of a case study, the analysis presented in this paper reveals that binders volumes are microarchives that can inform us as much about their collectors' tastes as they can about the cultural and social networks that surrounded them. Thank you.
Questions? Yes, please.
Sorry, David. Oh my goodness. Juan, as always, this was fantastic. Thank you so much. I was so inspired by your differentiation of mobility versus migration. I think that's such an important thing to talk about. And I did want to ask you a question about that, because these volumes give us glimpses into conversations we were never meant to hear, or like a behind the scenes, what happens behind closed doors, what happens in these intimate spaces, and we kind of get these little bits and pieces about all of that. And I wanted to know, regarding the 2 points you made about mobility and agency, do you have any experience in binders communicating with other binders in Latin America, where you can find connections between these collections of these networks that were being done, and how you can speak about following these pathways with other binders between these jovencitas del mundo, which I think is it's an amazing term. I feel like, or mujeres, women of the world, you know, were they communicating with each other, you know, through these networks and speaking through what they chose as ephemera to keep in their volumes? Thank you.
Thank you for this wonderful question, Teresita. I would say that we should consider the practice as a transnational practice that was happening simultaneously in different places. And what is fascinating about that is when you contrast the context of this is just an album, right? And when you contrast this with, for instance, with Isidoro Siguert's albums in Chile, or the research by Luis Merino, or the albums in Northern Chile researched by Fernanda Vera, or Manuel Izquierdo, or the albums in Brazil studied by Luisa Duarte, something that you will notice is they were aware, these ladies were aware that they were doing something that identified them with other people in other places. And many times, this music was imported by impresarios, right? Yes. Then you also have all these commercial networks working, I think that to understand the binders volumes in a meaningful manner, and at least in the Global South, we need to study these commercial networks. Because many of this music was circulated, but these commercial networks were also based on human relations. Then many times, friendship was the basis to build a commercial interchange between two different countries. As the case of family, and is the case of the Echeverria family, and Isidora Sigueros is her friends and family in Europe, then you notice that these connections are meaningful, and by gathering this, they are connecting all those networks within the private sphere, right? Then they are bridging. I think that we need to read against the grain the absence of these women in the public sphere. It's not that they're absent. Maybe we need to turn away, you know, Nancy Lau just told about that earlier today, the necessity of reading against the grain and all this erasing, like what means that erasing, how we can navigate that. And I fully agree with that. This is an example of that. They're not present in the public sphere, but they are so prevalent in the private sphere that we should pay attention to them. Thank you for your question.
Other questions? Lauren?
So this is just for information, for my information, because I don't know. So many of the examples you showed were manuscript, and are those written by the women? Are those like, you know, copied out? Are they like composer? And if they're composers, what does that say about the role of this formal, you know, manuscript circulation as opposed to publisher circulation?
Okay, in this case of this album, and it's fascinating, but it's not an exception. It's something that happens a lot in Latin America. Something that I have noticed here in the US, and this is a significant difference with the, you know, with the albums here. Many of the albums here are like collections of printed music. There, you have to consider that you have a market of handwritten copies of European editions. That's one thing. But also there was a whole culture of composing music for your friends, or also some special case. Then the result is many of these albums in Latin America are hybrid. If you check the content of this album, it's really, really, you know, it's difficult just to define what is this album. In Spain they have a special, because that also happened in Spain. In Spain they call them, in Biblioteca Nacional, you won't find the Spanish volumes or álbumes de señoritas. You will find as colecciones facticias, which means it's a collection made de facto by the owner. And they put together like manuscripts, printed music, you know, and if you think about that as the role of composers, maybe you're asking particularly about the Echeverria, the Echeverria member of the family who was composing music. Okay, we don't have works by her outside this album, as far as I know. I'm still tracing those. But say that some of her works were published, 2 of them. And there's a reason for that. The first one was published in a really luxurious edition for the time, with illustrations, and it's a lithographic edition, which is a quite expensive technique at that time. And it was for charity. It was for orphans, to collect money for orphans, and so forth and that. And the other one was a special gift and dedicated to Rafael Núñez, who later was president of the country. That showed you also the position of the family, why this woman was able to publish her music, right? And that's what makes really, really unusual, also the publication of this music by women. But I think that we need to pay more attention to those sources still Latin American. But, you know, maybe we will learn more about that as we research more about them.
Okay, I have a question.
Okay, you may have, you kind of, we should go over this thing after a while. You maybe have already answered this question, but in the last 15 or so years, we American scholars have learned about the importance of and ubiquity of binders volume in, say, around the 1830s through about the 1880s. In this country, we're increasingly understanding how popular they were in, say, places like the United Kingdom or in other European countries. I know zip about what's going on in North or in South America. And what you seem to be saying is this practice was just as robust in South America as it was in North America. And I guess I'm asking you, is that the case?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Indeed, it is. I would say that in Latin America, Latin American schools have been researching binder volumes for the last 30 years, since the late 90s.
So we're behind it.
I don't want to say that way, but you know, I don't want to sound rude here, but maybe because the material is published in Spanish, that shouldn't be a problem to read it or consult the material. Some scholars have been doing like really interesting work there for a long time. For instance, the works by Manuel Izquierdo, even questioning like, hey, should we consider, opera is prevalent in this binder volume? Then we should talk about opera as popular music maybe, And he said that almost 10 years ago. Then it is something that we should start to visit. And I will say that we need more communications and straight communication. And at some extent, that's also why I was so fascinated by this binder volume and all the political things happening with the Venezuelan diaspora, not just here in the US, but with in Latin America, which is happening. All this criminalization of Venezuelans with political undertones and a really dark political agenda. But these binder volumes, is showing that we are really more connected and benefited from this circulation and this mobility. And it's a cultural object that is an evidence that we can trace that really far in time. Then that's one of the reasons that encouraged me to present much about this particular document. And I will say, I would like to invite you to visit all these scholars, like the production. I just made a long list at the beginning just to highlight some. The work that Juan Francisco Sanz made, he just unfortunately passed away some years ago, but his work on Venezuelan binders volumes are fantastic. The works of Jose Peñin in the 19th, they made a whole conference, 3 days conference with Latin American and Spanish scholars. They published a book in Venezuela about salon music, and a big chunk of that was binders volume. In Yaspum, 6 years ago in Yaspum, the Latin American branch of Yaspum, we had 3 panels just on binder volumes. Then I think that we can learn more about each other. We have these dialogues and these spaces. Thank you for asking.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, our third presenter.
Is this still on?
Yes, it is. Our third presenter is Emily Eubanks, who's visiting assistant professor at Florida State University, where she completed her PhD in the fall of 2024. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Her interests include women's music history, including musical patronage, management, domestic music making, and 19th century salon culture, and her research has been funded by the AMS, the Central European History Society, and the Fulbright Foundation. One of her current projects is an exploration of how music and sound in an early 19th century Viennese salon promoted Austrian patriotism and German nationalism. Today, however, we will hear about a binder's volume from the American South in a paper titled Ella Duncan's Souvenir des Alpes, on nostalgia and difference in women's binders volumes in the 19th century South. Emily.
Before I get started, first of all, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I do have a QR code to a handout that I'd encourage you to access. We have a few physical copies if you prefer that, but the QR code will show up again later in the presentation as well.
Raise your hand if you'd like a hard copy.
In the chilled room of the Wiley L. Housewright Special Collections at Florida State University's Warren D. Allen Music Library sits a large bound collection of 19th century sheet music. The embossed gold letters across the front of this leather-covered collection identify the original owner, Hella, or Ella, Duncan, a white woman from St. Louis, Missouri. Born in 1853, Duncan was the daughter of successful Irish and Scottish immigrants. In St. Louis, her father became a partner in the highly successful William Barr Dry Goods Company, suggesting that Duncan would have received a thorough music education, either at a school for girls or through private instruction. Duncan saved and passed her sheet music volume down to her granddaughter, Elizabeth Van Campen, who donated the collection to the St. Augustine Historical Society in 1970. While leafing through the 43 solo piano pieces preserved in Duncan's collection, I was intrigued by the detailed illustrations and reference to the Alps on one score in particular, Joseph Asher's Souvenir des Alpes, Chant des Montagnards. In this paper, I first contextualized Duncan's copy of Souvenir des Alpes to better understand the appeal of place-based musical souvenirs for 19th century sheet music consumers. As this appeal was largely based on the ability of souvenirs to capture and domesticate a memory of another culture, Such compositions construct a nostalgia for their original environments. I demonstrate how the Alpine musical tropes found within the souvenir both locate the original environment and foster additional cultural associations of nostalgia. Through these tropes, I illustrate how this domesticated keepsake established cultural difference that could have aligned with consumers' own values and identities. Though Ella Duncan's personal motivations for purchasing, performing, and preserving this musical souvenir remain unknown, I understand this score and the binder's volume in which it sits today to be a testament to her artistic and individual agency, ultimately serving as a souvenir of Ella Duncan. When the Jewish composer Joseph Asher aimed to capture Alpine music culture in Souvenir d'Alpe, he contributed to broader trends of Alpine tourism and souvenir collecting. By the second half of the 19th century, the Alps had attained a prominent place in the European-American cultural imagination and become a popular destination for a growing number of middle-class tourists. Scholars, including Benjamin Walton and Alison Frank, have discussed this widespread fascination with Alpine location, culture, and travel that appeared across poetic works, travel writings, landscape paintings, and musical compositions. This appeal was largely inspired by traveling Tyrolean singing families, including the Rainers, who toured the US from 1839 to 1843. Adaptations of their songs were soon available in print, such as the Tyrolese Melodie by Asher's teacher, Ignaz Moscheles. Such 19th century associations celebrated the sublimity of the Alps, praising their so-called purity, innocence, and healthiness brought about by their isolation. As interest in the Alps and Alpine communities grew, travel to Swiss and Austrian mountain ranges also increased. The elitist appeal of the Grand Tour gave way to broader trends of tourism as expanded railways and roads increased access to European travel. By the end of the century, summer travel to sanatoria and spa towns had extended into winter as skiing, tobogganing, and hiking societies gained popularity by the 1880s. In her study on sonic tourism in 19th century Switzerland, Emily Loeffler has discussed the dissonance that many travelers experienced when encountering Alpine inhabitants. For many English tourists, their preconceived connotations of the Alps as pristine and idealized were incongruous with the rural, often poor Alpine singers that they encountered when visiting the Alps. This incongruence, Loeffler suggests, forced many English travelers to, quote, confront a tension between the beauty of nature and the ugliness of poverty. As travelers to the Alps encountered these new places and people, many desired to bring home a token of their journeys. This demand was largely met by mass-produced souvenirs, including miniature figurines, sand pictures, and wood carvings. Travel memorabilia offered visitors a reminder of their experiences that could be displayed in their homes, signaling to guests the well-traveled, culturally refined status of their owners. In her analysis on the appeal and autobiographical function of souvenirs, the literary scholar Susan Stewart notes that in the home, souvenirs served as metaphors of an other, a site, culture, or memory beyond the domestic realm and its inhabitants. Representing a distance between origin and possessor, souvenirs inherently produce a sense of nostalgia or longing. Stewart writes that within this nostalgic gap between the original environment and the possessor, a new narrative of origin is created. This newly constructed narrative typically reveals more about the possessor than it does the souvenir's actual origin, rendering these objects autobiographical in nature. Like other mass-produced mementos, musical souvenirs were meant to instill nostalgia among listeners for a site or culture beyond the home. Asher's output alone included no fewer than 8 pieces titled Souvenir for solo piano, including opera fantasies, works depicting a specific point in time, as well as compositions simply titled Souvenir. Such range and volume reflect the marketability of this category of composition for amateur music making. Asher's output also included musical souvenirs attempting to aurally capture the experience of visiting a distant locale, city, or culture. Such place-based musical souvenirs were typically infused with dances that were culturally specific enough to be widely associated with a particular region, such as a waltz for a Syrian souvenir. As in the case of Souvenir d'Alpe, melodies and singing techniques could also be used to help locate the source of musical souvenirs. place-based souvenirs heard in the concert hall or the comfort of one's own home promised 19th century listeners a glimpse of the unfamiliar, distant places, even those they had never personally visited. Both Asher and his publisher, Schott, recognized the marketability of Alpine-inspired souvenirs during the mid-19th century. According to a surviving Schott catalog, 4,100 copies of Asher's piece were printed between its first publication in 1857 and 1898. This large number of prints of Asher's Souvenir d'Alpe that were disseminated and sold throughout Europe and the United States attests to the substantial transatlantic market for Alpine musical souvenirs. Joseph's Souvenir d'Alpe and other place-based musical souvenirs reflected broader 19th century trends of musical exoticism, as keepsakes designed to be extracted from their original environments and brought into new domesticated spaces. Place-based musical souvenirs serve as incomplete, reduced samples of larger places or experiences. By relying on a reductive extraction of signs from a cultural whole, souvenirs of other cultures can share exoticist traits with other travel-related collecting trends of the second half of the 19th century, such as personal collections of curiosities and the increasingly popular natural history museum exhibits across Europe. The appeal of souvenirs from other cultures was largely based in their ability to domesticate idealized, often simplified versions of another culture or place in such a way that catered to the tastes and demands of the consumer market. In the case of place-based musical souvenirs, the original significance and function of regionally specific dances, songs, or performance techniques are often altered or lost altogether in order to appeal to the amateur music market. Thus, studying how people created, accumulated, and displayed place-based musical souvenirs can reveal how these pieces constructed identity through difference, but often offer relatively little insight about the people, places, and cultures from which they originated. In Souvenir d'Alpe, Asher evokes Alpine music culture through distinct musical tropes, including the Swiss ronde de vache. These melodies were based on the range and harmonic workings of the Alp horn and often featured short, repetitive melodic ideas, limited ranges, and occasionally onomatopoetic figures. The second theme of Asher's composition, shown on the bottom half of the slide, shares many features with the opening of a ronde de vache tune published by Ferdinand Huber in 1818, including the triple meter, the key of G major, and similar opening intervallic movement. Charlotte Bonneau has noted that the Alp horn was originally played for communication by herdsmen on mountain meadows, quote, for signaling and to keep in touch with people in the valley or on other Alps, and also to calm the cows, to attract cows for milking, and for prayers. Audible up to 8 kilometers away, Alp horns instilled a general fascination with the sensation of hearing an Alp horn in nature from a distance. The sonic range of the Alp horn made this musical tradition and its corresponding melodies rich sources for constructed representations of idyllic locales. Ronde de vache melodies also carried larger cultural associations with the concept of nostalgia. As early as 1710, ronde de vache melodies were credited with instilling nostalgia or intense homesickness among Swiss listeners when separated from home. Such associations with nostalgia were affirmed throughout the 18th century, thanks to texts such as Rousseau's 1764 Dictionnaire de musique. Emily Loeffler has traced the domestication of these herding melodies that occurred as they were extracted from their original Alpine contexts and published for mass consumption. In early 19th century notated collections, harmonic progressions were altered, keyboard accompaniment was added, and microtones were removed to modify these melodies for indoor settings and amateur performers. As growing numbers of tourists visited the Alps, Alpine music came to be a major tourist attraction for travelers along various popular routes and destinations. For those who could not personally travel to the Alps to hear ronde de vache melodies, published sheet music offered a more accessible alternative. While these melodies evoked intense homesickness for Swiss listeners, they served a reverse function for Duncan and other American buyers. When relocated into a commercialized musical souvenir, rendezvous signaled an elsewhere beyond the home. In this context, rendezvous became a reminder of idealized travels to a distant place and culture from the comfort of buyers' homes. The ability to purchase, perform, and display such place-specific melodies from another culture likely appealed to many sheet music collectors, including Duncan. As these musical markers increased in popularity, they continued to carry associations of nostalgia, initially for the Swiss home and later for travel beyond the home. Including a melody resembling a rendezvous in a piece marketed as a souvenir or memory then seems particularly fitting. Though yodeling motives are not prominently found in Ascher's Souvenir d'Alpe, it is possible that he intended to disjunct motion of the second main theme to evoke the rapid registral changes typical of yodeling. Yodeling figures often employ repeated arpeggios and second inversion, successive leaps of major sixths or octaves, or wordless calls. Ascher's theme begins with a rising interval of a ninth from A up to B, and then repeats this motion 3 times, with the opening interval becoming smaller with each iteration. Musicologist Tim Weiss has shown that by the time Ascher's piece was sold across the Atlantic, the yodel could be found in both classical and popular music genres in the United States, appearing in the mountain-style music of the Hutchinson family singers, as well as blackface minstrelsy performances. Admittedly, it's impossible to uncover exactly how this American popularization of the yodel shaped Duncan's and other sheet music collectors' perceptions of alpine yodeling. Tracing the incorporation of the yodel into musical practices in the United States, however, raises important questions surrounding issues of class and race and the recontextualization of musical tropes. Finally, Ascher seems to have employed the echo as well as a stock musical marker of alpine culture, emulating the natural effect that would have occurred as sound traveled across mountain ranges. In the dramatic, sparse opening of Souvenir d'Alpe, the first 7 measures are immediately repeated at a softer dynamic level and lower register, along with a retardando to suggest the fading effect of the melodic material as it traveled further away from the listener. At the end of this piece, Ascher creates an even more dramatic echo by repeating a 1-measure rhythmic motive across the span of 29 measures, progressively decreasing in dynamics, tempo, and register. The inclusion of these stock musical markers for the Alps points to the constructed character of this musical souvenir. Rather than offering consumers notated examples of the music they might hear when spending time in the Alps, Ascher infuses established musical tropes of the Alps into a typical salon piece, thereby ensuring that his composition would appeal to a broad range of transatlantic sheet music buyers. As an extracted fragment of alpine nostalgia, Souvenir d'Alpe allowed American sheet music consumers to display their interest in the culture of an idealized, distant mountain destination. The exact range of the Alps that Ascher aimed to represent remains unclear. Tyrolean culture is suggested by the hat on the cover illustration and the origins of the yodel, and Swiss culture is suggested by the use of a rendezvous melody and larger popular 19th century associations of the yodel with Switzerland. By crafting a newly composed, mass-produced version of alpine culture, Ascher created a souvenir that not only catered to growing interest in travel and souvenir culture, but also reflected the domestication of the other music cultures. Though Duncan's and other consumers' personal motivations for purchasing this piece will never be fully recovered, these larger cultural trends might offer insight into how place-based musical souvenirs could align with ideas about cultural difference for sheet music collectors in the United States. Ella Duncan's motivations for owning and preserving this souvenir can be further suggested by her social and economic status as a white wealthy woman in the southern United States. As a young woman of the wealthy class, Duncan would have been expected to put her musical skills on display in the family's parlor, which we heard from Betsy previously. Candace Bailey has shown that the parlor served as a stage where women exercised the genteel rules of etiquette through refined manners and accomplished yet controlled musical performances. As a moderately technical piece, Souvenir d'Alpe would have aligned with the expectations placed on Duncan and other piano girls to play music that required an acceptable amount of physical exertion. It's also possible that Duncan was drawn to Ascher's piece due to previous encounters with the many Tyrolean singing groups who toured the US or publications of their repertoire. Close examination of Duncan's score reveals penciled-in fingerings indicating the time that she spent learning this piece and presumably performing it either for herself or for an audience. Edits to the notated music include alterations of printed dynamic and articulation markings, as well as the addition of new markings and rolled chords, new dynamic markings and rolled chords, rather. One can almost picture Duncan playing through her score, stopping to scribble in performance markings and edits, relying on her musicianship and personal preferences to craft her own artistic interpretation of this souvenir. In her work on Amateur's reproduction of musical scores in 18th century America, Linda Goodman has discussed how such manipulation of a score, quote, provided amateurs an outlet for self-display, and thus spoke to a desire to make personal taste externally evident. As Duncan constructed her own version and memories of this piece, she further enhanced the autobiographical nature of souvenirs, crafting her own version of the Alpine memories Asher's score represented. When she performed Souvenir de Alpes in the parlor, Duncan's constructed memory of the Alps that she brought to life was not wholly Asher's, but also her own. As was common for wealthy young women, Duncan's collection of sheet music was bound together before she married in 1873. No longer a practical source for reading and performing music, Asher's Souvenir de Alpes and other piano scores in Duncan's binder's volume became visual reminders or personal souvenirs of her musical accomplishments, activities, and taste prior to marriage. It would have been appropriate to display these objects in the family's parlor, serving as a testament of Duncan and her family's social status to countless visitors who frequented their home. The act of creating and owning a binder's volume inherently reflects a practice of self-writing that, as Bailey notes, may have been the only surviving archive for many American women of the 19th century. Thus, Duncan's preservation of her volume reflects not only her artistic legacy, but also her individual agency, offering a glimpse of the way she remembered her early life and the memories, or souvenirs, that she hoped to leave behind. With this in mind, I'll conclude by highlighting one significant discrepancy in Asher's Souvenir de Alpes. While the cover of Asher's piece suggests this is a singular souvenir of the Alps, the printed title above the notated music indicates that it might instead represent multiple souvenirs. Though this is likely an unintentional inconsistency, it's nice to think that what on first appearance seems to be a musical souvenir of a single cultural reference is actually holds souvenirs of many peoples and places. As a microhistorical object, Duncan's score illuminates how she exercised agency in selecting a piece of sheet music that aligned with her interest in the Alps, and through this, reflected broader trends of alpine travel and sonic tourism in the 19th century United States. Duncan's copy of Souvenir de Alpes also demonstrates how place-based musical souvenirs could appeal to 19th century sheet music consumers as a means of constructing identity. While fostering nostalgia through its musical tropes, Asher's composition also facilitated nostalgia as a musical souvenir, offering insight into how these products of sonic tourism established cultural difference that could align with consumers' values and identities. Finally, Duncan's copy of Souvenir de Alpes attests to her individual agency as she edited and performed her own version of this work, ultimately acting as a souvenir of Duncan and her life. Thank you.
Questions? Bill?
That was terrific. I enjoyed it a lot. I have two interrelated questions, and then I'll add a little coda, which is why I'm asking them. The interrelated questions are do the rest of the volume bear out bear out the style and the interests that are manifested in this piece? In other words, for example, are there lots more souvenirs? Are the piano pieces of equal difficulty? And in particular, is there, as there would have been at the time possibly, is there a kind of emphasis on waltz-based or Central European or Germanic repertoire? The second question is, do we know who taught Ella Duncan, who was her piano teacher? And the third comment, why I'm asking that, is because there was such a huge and strong and important German community in St. Louis. And I can easily imagine her being taught by a German piano teacher and being directed to this piece, not because of her nostalgia for the Alps, but because of her teacher's nostalgia.
Yes, thank you so much for this wealth of questions and information. I appreciate it. I'll start with the easiest question to answer, which is, do we know who she studied keyboard with? And unfortunately, I have not been able to track that down. But I really appreciate this nugget of information about German communities in St. Louis, and maybe that's a way to find a potential list of teachers.
Yep.
So the rest of this volume, and there are actually 2 volumes that we know Ella owned that are in this Special Collections Archive. And across the 2 volumes, there are 86 pieces in total. You are correct in assuming that they follow this trend of German, specifically German, but larger European souvenirs. I don't remember the exact number of souvenirs in the piece, but this is not the only one. I will also add that I believe in this volume alone, if not across the 2 volumes, I think there are 8 Alpine-inspired pieces. So this is just one reflecting that larger trend and interest in Alpine culture during this period. Let me see if I answered all of your questions. And in terms of difficulty, I would say it's a good example of what the others call for performance-wise. So, thank you.
Can I follow up on that?
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, great, interesting stuff. I guess my question, I got some prosaic questions and I want to pull them together, but one is, when was the Asher piece published? And 2, did Duncan ever go abroad?
Oh yeah, that's a
Oh,
question.
she did, okay.
No, I don't know. I found no evidence of her traveling abroad. It's possible, it's just one of those things that I have not been able to uncover one way or the other. And the Asher piece, let's see, I believe it was 1873 when it was published.
Okay, I didn't see it, I didn't hear you say it.
Oh, I'm so sorry, 1857.
Oh, okay,
She
okay.
married in 1873, and her maiden
Right.
name is on the binder, so I'm assuming she had it found.
Yeah, because I was wondering because, I mean, you mentioned the Rainier family and the whole Tyrolean thing was so prominent in the 1830s and 40s, and by the 50s, 60s, thereabouts. I'm wondering if it maybe if that craze had the Tyrolean families and so forth, that had kind of died out a little bit. I don't know, maybe somebody else does. Bill?
I'll just say that there are minstrel companies still parodying the Rainier, no,
Yes, absolutely. By the second half of the 19th century.
There are minstrel companies parodying the Rainier troops and other Swiss singers on up through the 1880s, very successfully. People made whole careers out of it.
Yeah. And the Rainier family in particular, I don't remember if I mentioned this in this version of the project, but they had a stint in St. Louis. That was a 40 or 43-day period where they stayed in St. Louis to perform.
Which would work with
Yeah.
the German community, and I really like your idea that this was that her piano teacher, a souvenir of that person. That's a great suggestion. Are there other questions? Yes, Tom.
It's a sidebar to the Rainier family. The Hutchinson family, of course, imitated them widely. Did they do any alpine thing? I mean, New Hampshire has mountains too. And that's where they're from.
I haven't found anything that says they directly borrowed from the Rainiers beyond this yodel singing style. But if anyone knows of more detailed information on that, I would welcome it.
Another sidebar, I've just become acquainted with a wonderful 90-year-old lady in Ohio who grew up in a Swiss populated town in southern Ohio. And I said, do you yodel? This is a woman who sung on Broadway, and she can, and does.
Are we done? Okay, I think a round of applause for our entire. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.
I wrote down those sources that you mentioned from the night to go with those lines. Oh, okay. It's I think I have it from the Airforce Library. I will definitely reach out to you about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, interesting stuff, and I have no idea about what's going on. And, I could have been slightly wrong about 15 minutes, but I mean, Ken's page, Sunday,
I missed the
rather than in but I actually wrote an essay as an introduction
It's fine. I think that when people in Latin America there was a right to one was there was interesting tweet that was related to time before
Barcelona, I mean,
yeah, and it's also based on the station. I would say the other thing is the lifestyle period. We start to project that I don't know. Like on my
of course, it's the period legally whatever, and which is cheating.
then you put that. That's when many of the researchers start
in this country, in American musicology or musicology in general, it's been like, it's just, I mean, you're going to be she's Irish. And she said she's the chair of the committee
oh, definitely. Because also the, like,
sorry?
in this one, lady died.
Yeah. It's just nostalgic, sentimental, and if you look at some of our texts, and it's not American music text, it's about Chase and so earlier, it put down the sentimentality. It's all sentimental.
Seattle,
That's over in Europe. In fact, somebody asked me.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I'm trying to
There was going to be a conversation about
the 21st century.
because there's so much. Gosh, look at this.
Not really. I know taking them around
Extrapolation and telling me things about the culture of the country.
Something like that's depending on you pay attention to these things.
and sort of trying to make safety of street.
Because stars are many
Now
times
it's the whole, you have to demonstrate that all those factors. That's what it is. Confederacy, war, sure. Financially benefited from that. Or it's just, I think good. It's just too messy. It's like, what am I actually doing?
Did you find my suggestion?
Let me see again.
Okay, we'll go over now.
Oh, thank you. Also the intro. Yeah, because you have to but that's fantastic because the English is, it's not but it's also, I think it's also the idea of providing some sort of guidance to the thing that you are emulating, like giving you an insight. Yeah. No, but that's fantastic. I really enjoy sharing this space together. Oh, yes, please.
Together.
Oh, I knew it was definitely place to start, and so I'm just, kind of whittle it down.
And that's what it sounded like. It felt like it was okay. And I think it said something.
Yeah, and I was like, oh, she's right on.
Get rid of all this food. It's Tom Emily. They're together at lunch. Or Daniel Evans.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, there was a lot of stuff in there that you needed in a larger chapters. It's good to know what she's doing. It's yeah, good papers for us.
Yeah.